Imagine stepping from the safety of your chair, the comfort of your study, into a galaxy you only thought existed on paper, in codices and in whispered theories. The worlds, the horrors, the gods you debated as abstract concepts are suddenly tangible, immense, and indifferent. This is the story of a Warhammer theorist who became a witness to the universe he had studied, and for whom every expectation of control shattered the moment he arrived. The first strike was the air itself. Thick, metallic, and pungent with industrial oils, it clung to his lungs, stinging the back of his throat. Each breath drew coughing spasms and vertigo as rain-slick grime mixed with chemical haze. Beneath his boots, vibrations pulsed, machines too massive to see or transport, skimmers moving just beyond perception. The city surged around him, alive, and he was unprepared to keep pace. Steel towers loomed overhead, etched with jagged reliefs and glyphs he had only seen in codices. Spires clawed at the bruised sky, streaked with rain, lightning tinting the clouds green. Winged eagles, skulls sealed in wax, stylized flames, symbols that had once been flat images now leered down, impossibly real. The codices had been simplifications. Reality demanded more. Citizens advanced in mechanical precision, augmented faces pale or scarred, servos whirring. Hovering servo skulls circled, emitting soft clicks and hums, probing for movement. One turned sharply, forcing him to duck instinctively. Steam hissed from vents. The smell of molten promethium mingled with wet stone. Rat-like scavengers darted along the gutters, their claws clicking. Every micro-movement demanded attention. He moved toward an intersection, scanning relentlessly. Bridges, walls, and towers formed patterns from memory, yet the lived reality warped perception. Rain dripped from jagged pipes. Puddles reflected fragmented neon and dim hanging lamps. A soaked banner whipped against stone above, striking violently in gusts. He reached toward it instinctively, then pulled back. The world did not tolerate curiosity without caution. Lightning flashed again, revealing a transport skimming between towers. Its shadow consumed the street, dwarfing all beneath. Engines roared and vibrations surged through the boots and spine. Somewhere within, soldiers trained for instant annihilation. The memorized chapters and campaigns of his texts carried a tangible weight he had never felt. He sidestepped scaffolding, ducked under servitor arms, and pressed his back to a wall. Sparks leapt from exposed conduits, reflecting off puddles. Every step, glance, and breath was a negotiation with the city itself. Children scurried past with mechanical precision, barely acknowledging the chaos. Symbols of the emperor were etched into stone and metal, law embodied in form and function. A cathedral loomed at the end of the avenue, doors spilling worshippers into the rain. They carried relics, chanted and bowed with an intensity the theorist could not process. The codices had hinted at devotion, but the smell of incense, the thrum of collective fear, the physicality of obedience rendered theory meaningless. Faith was heavy. Fear was weight. Obedience was palpable. Beyond the cathedral, the avenues narrowed into twisting alleys. Rain pooled in cracked cobblestones, reflecting the flickering neon and faint glow of overhead lamps. Each splash echoed in the confined space. The observer's boots slid through sludge, careful, precise. Machinery hissed from above. Pneumatic servitor limbs squealed as they labored. One servo turned its glowing lens toward him, forcing a rapid duck. A rat scuttled past his foot, disappearing into shadow. Movement was survival. Hesitation could be fatal. Shadows stretched along walls, streaked with grime, rivets catching dim light. A torn banner whipped violently overhead, streaking the alley with blurred colors. He realized that even a single misstep could draw attention. Observation alone was insufficient. Motion, caution, and timing were as critical as breathing. A distant roar split the air. He looked up. A transport skimmer cut between towers, engines shaking the atmosphere. Its shadow swallowed streets in seconds, forcing him against the wall. The metallic tang of fear filled his mouth. Somewhere inside, trained soldiers waited, an invisible weight pressing down. He felt the readiness of death as though it were tangible. The alley opened into a small plaza. Servitors herded citizens with mechanical insistence, hydraulic joints squealing. Children and the elderly alike moved in synchronized steps, heads lowered. Every chant, every gesture of devotion carried physical weight, pressing in on him. Theory was meaningless here. Memorized knowledge offered no protection. Awareness, endurance, and luck were the only shields. At the plaza's center, a fountain gurgled, mingling water with grime. Worshippers knelt in perfect rhythm, robes soaked, voices rising in unified devotion. He traced each movement, every expression, noting details that codices could not convey. Faith had substance. It could be measured, feared, endured, but not understood from observation alone. Muscles ached from constant vigilance. Boots slid on wet plates. Shoulders bore the weight of tension. Steam hissed from nearby vents. Each inhale burned. Each exhale fogged the air. He was immersed fully, caught in the living pulse of a city that cared nothing for theory. Presence demanded action. Motion dictated comprehension. Survival required immersion. A narrow, twisting alley beckoned. Curiosity overcame caution. He stepped into the darkness, boots splashing in puddles, eyes darting to every shadow. Walls glistened with grime, rivets reflected faint light. Machinery hissed above. He pressed against the wall, listening, each distant footfall, clang and whisper, a note in a symphony he could not control. The spire of another cathedral pierced the clouded sky. Bells rang low, resonating through stone and metal, merging with chants from the plaza. Faith, fear, obedience, he felt them as a living pulse. Codices could not guide him. Patterns dissolved into a torrent of sight, sound, smell, and motion. Emerging onto a broader avenue, drenched and exhausted, he continued forward. Rain streaked his face, hair clung to skin. Every movement required calculation, avoiding servitors, dodging dripping pipes, stepping around puddles, reading banners whipping overhead. He understood at last that knowledge alone could not protect him. Awareness, endurance, and careful adaptation were vital. The city was alive, unyielding, and it had claimed him. Theory was impotent. Lore held no power. Survival demanded motion, attention, and constant vigilance. The theorist's boots sank into the grime of the industrial avenue, each step sending ripples through puddles dark with oil, runoff, and soot. Steam hissed from fractured vents, curling around his legs like restless tendrils, carrying acrid fumes that stung his throat. Rain slicked his robes to skin, each movement demanding precise care. The city did not pause for observation. It pressed, insistent and unforgiving. Citizens moved with mechanical grace. Workers balanced molten containers, tools, and crates without a glance at one another. Children clutched mechanical supports, murmuring prayers as their tiny limbs were guided by pneumatic braces. One faltered, water sloshing from a container, and a servo limb shot out, steadying the load without hesitation. Correction here was silent, absolute. Mercy had no currency in the rhythm of survival. A metallic clang echoed as a hydraulic arm struck a conveyor, sparks flying in a brief, violent arc. The theorist ducked instinctively. Around him, pistons hissed, chains rattled, and the low thrum of machinery created a relentless percussion. Every sound carried weight, every vibration demanded attention. Observation alone could not suffice. Survival required anticipation, adaptability, and a constant negotiation with environment. Turning into a narrow market alley, he confronted the human calculus of desperation and industry. Rusted cybernetic limbs glimmered beneath flickering lamps, ocular implants reflected in puddles, and neural interfaces hummed faintly, exposed to the rain. The smell of molten metal mingled with burnt insulation, a sensory assault he had never encountered in codices. The theorist flinched as he recognized the practical, improvisational cruelty of reality. Every augmentation a survival tactic, every face a lesson in functional fear. Steam burst from grates at his feet, hissing across stone and metal. The air shimmered, carrying the faint scent of ozone and scorched circuits. Above him, a crane swung a load of scrap, each pendulum arc threatening a misstep. He sidestepped into a shadow, chest tight, calculating trajectory and timing. The world did not care for his presence, yet punished inattention without ceremony. A low hum rose from the infrastructure. Hydraulic pistons groaned in counterpoint to distant skimmer engines. The theorist glimpsed a bridge above, spanning the square. From its height, massive banners flapped violently, soaked, their embroidered doctrine unreadable in the rain. Below, servitors guided citizens with inhuman efficiency. One child tripped, an arm shot out, a whispered hiss of pressurized air, and the fall was arrested. Each correction, mechanical and indifferent, underscored the city's laws. Survival was earned through vigilance, not understanding. He pressed onward, boots sliding on wet metal plates, eyes scanning the flurry of human motion and machinery. Rainwater pooled in rivets and gutters, reflecting sparks, flickering lamps, and shadowed faces in distorted symmetry. The theorist's mind raced. This was not narrative, not allegory. Every microsecond, every glance, every misstep could be consequential. A skimmer roared above, engines tearing through the wet air. Its shadow swallowed streets, bridges, and pedestrians alike. Soldiers inside remained unseen, trained to terminate threats with cold precision. He pressed against the alley wall, calculating angles, breathing shallow, pulse syncopating with the machinery's thrum. Theory offered nothing. Survival demanded motion, awareness, and a willingness to be part of the city's ceaseless pattern. The alley opened into a wider square, where molten vats, conveyor systems, and hydraulic presses operated in symphonic coordination. Sparks leapt from exposed wiring, dancing across puddles like fragmented stars. A misaligned beam creaked and swung dangerously. The theorist dived aside, barely avoiding impact. Each hazard was unique, demanding constant recalibration. Grimdark was not a concept here. It was a living, moving infrastructure, and he was one small element within it. Steam hissed from vents overhead, and the acrid tang of burning hydrocarbon filled his nostrils. Workers moved with unwavering focus. Any lapse was corrected instantly. The theorist realized that his presence was noticed, measured, but not acknowledged. He was a participant in the system's relentless enforcement. Observation was no shield. Action was mandatory. Through the haze, a distant bell tolled, low and resonant. Its vibrations merged with the rhythmic hiss of pistons, the clang of metal, and the soft, unbroken murmur of the populace.
Faith, fear, and labor fused into a single pulse. He felt it in chest and spine, a weight beyond codices, beyond simulation. Theory was powerless. He could only move, adapt, endure. He moved deeper into the industrial heart, where the avenues narrowed and machinery pressed from both sides. Sparks leapt from overhead conduits, tracing fragile arcs across puddles. Steam hissed around his legs, carrying the sharp scent of ozone and molten metal. The ground vibrated faintly with the distant rumble of transport skimmers and hydraulic presses, each tremor a subtle reminder that the city had its own pulse, indifferent to him. A line of citizens passed, carrying metal containers that glowed with molten alloy. One man's grip faltered. A servitor's arm shot out with pneumatic precision, steadying the load before it spilled. The correction was silent, unfeeling, absolute. The theorist flinched, aware that in this world errors were punished mechanically, without deliberation, without grace. Survival was not about understanding, it was about action, attention, and adaptation. The alleyway opened to a square dominated by a memorial wall. Glass-encased candles flickered against engraved metal plaques listing names of the fallen. Citizens moved past, murmuring prayers, laying scraps or small offerings with precise ritual. The theorist felt awe and unease, realizing that devotion itself had become functional, codified into the rhythm of life. Faith was an instrument of the city, not an inspiration. A sudden shriek of machinery tore across the square. He glanced up as a massive skimmer descended, engines roaring, shadow swallowing streets and alleys alike. Soldiers within remained unseen, but he imagined the lethal readiness behind every armored viewport. His body pressed instinctively against a wall, chest tight, calculating trajectory, timing, and distance. Knowledge of theory was insufficient. Motion, presence, and vigilance were the only defenses. Passing through a narrow alleyway, he noticed the market stalls of cybernetic limbs, ocular implants, and worn neural interfaces. Citizens examined them with meticulous care, negotiating silently over flickering lights and exposed circuitry. The air smelled of scorching metal, ozone, and damp grime. He watched, understanding for the first time that every transaction was a negotiation with necessity and survival. Grimdark existed not only in battle or cruelty, it was embedded in every act, every compromise. Steam hissed, rising in curling sheets around his shoulders. A crane swung a load of scrap above, threatening to knock him off balance if he misstepped. He calculated the path, timed the movements, and slipped past. The city was a constant calculus, a system that required participation, not observation. Each breath, each glance, each movement was data and defense entwined. The theorist ascended a narrow staircase leading toward a high bridge. Rain slicked metal pressed against his boots. The handrails vibrated faintly under the mechanical weight of unseen vehicles. Above, banners whipped violently in the storm, embroidered doctrine indecipherable in sheets of rain. Servitors moved among citizens, correcting missteps and forcing order with hydraulic inevitability. He climbed steadily, awareness stretched taut, muscles coiling for every potential hazard. From the bridge, he could see the vast industrial sprawl, chimneys belching smoke and fire into a gray, rain-streaked sky. Skimmers raced below, their shadows swallowing streets and alleys. The city's rhythm pulsed around him, the hiss of steam, the clang of metal, the faint hum of distant engines. He felt the weight of the Imperium, not as ideology, but as a living mechanical presence pressing down through space and time. He moved cautiously along the high-span bridge, surveying dangers from every angle. A Tau drone zipped past, scanning the area. Its sensors briefly focused on him, forcing him to duck behind girders. The shadow of a Necron collector, Trazen perhaps, passed on the walkway below, glinting metal reflecting the storm. Harlequins flickered through the air, their movements both distracting and deliberate, guiding him unknowingly toward the collector. Every faction's presence added new layers of danger. Every step was a negotiation with inevitability. Breathing shallow, muscles trembling, he navigated puddles, rails, and the occasional protruding cable. Sparks jumped from broken conduits, illuminating the dark rain with jagged light. The city had transformed from a space of observation into a cage of vigilance. The theorist was no longer an outsider. He was a participant, forced to react, adapt, and survive in real time. Theory, codices, and prior knowledge offered no protection here. At last, he reached the far side of the bridge, drenched and exhausted. The banners flapped violently overhead, the steam hissed, and distant machinery pulsed like a living organism. He paused, scanning the sprawl, feeling for openings, calculating every threat. Grimdark was no longer a concept, it was infrastructure, an omnipresent force he could neither analyze nor escape. Presence, awareness, and cautious movement had become his only tools. The city demanded participation, and he had no choice but to comply.
The first stirrings of sleep brought unease that was not quite fear. Whispers coiled along the edges of perception, syllables without language, deliberate yet intangible. Each pulse of his heart seemed amplified, echoing as though the walls themselves counted. Shadows in the corners stretched, recoiled, flickered, a nervous dance that he couldn't ignore. He reached for his notebook, only to see the ink quiver and crawl like insects along the page. Leaning closer made them vanish. The acrid tang of burnt paper mixed with faint ozone, sharp and biting. The low hum from beneath the floorboards vibrated through his feet, unsettling, alive. He stumbled back, hands brushing the edge of a chair, the room's subtle shifts forcing him to recalculate his every move. A mirror on the wall betrayed him. His reflection lagged, eyes widening moments before he moved, lips curling into a smile too soon. Shapes, wrong, fleeting, hovered just behind him, vanishing when he dared to look elsewhere. Familiar objects twitched independently, reacting to some force beyond understanding. A clock's hands raced and halted, unsure of rhythm. His pulse matched it, exaggerated, discordant, a drum of unease. The whispering intensified, brushing across the edges of his mind. Impressions, not words, pressed against him. Curiosity, urgency, detachment. His limbs grew heavy, muscles refused simple commands. A scream lodged somewhere between throat and chest, unformed, smothered by the thickening air. He braced against the table, knuckles whitening, as the room began a slow, insidious movement. Shelves leaned, trembling, books rattled, sliding like tiny avalanches. Chairs crawled a few inches, defying expectation. Each step became a negotiation with a space that had abandoned rules. He staggered backward, every muscle tensed, feeling the room's hostility as a physical weight. The mirror's eyes widened again, shadows pooling unnaturally beneath them. His own hands appeared elongated, reaching beyond natural angles, fingers twitching with subtle life of their own. The air buzzed with static. Every blink fractured vision slightly, a strobe of shifting forms. A bead of sweat ran down his temple, tasting metallic. Dawn approached, and the world had become elastic, bending subtly yet uncomfortably. Shadows clung unnaturally, objects moved just beyond recognition, whispers layered like a chorus of unseen spectators.
Trembling, he realized that the boundaries of matter, motion, and perception had begun to fail him. Observation alone was powerless. He pressed his palms to the warped tabletop, steadying himself. The floor felt soft, quivering beneath boots, vibrating with unaccountable resonance. A subtle scent of ozone mixed with scorched ink clung to the air, wrapping around him. Shapes flickered in peripheral vision, impossible to track. A bookcase leaned forward, then recoiled, fragments of diagrams twisting into grotesque shapes. He stumbled, pivoting to regain balance as the chair slid out from beneath him. His own reflection had become a stranger. Eyes widened at moments he did not. A shadow flickered at the corner of his mouth, the familiar face dissolving into variations of himself. Heart hammering in discord with the warped room, he pressed his back against the wall, muscles quivering with effort. Each breath burned, lungs pulled at dense, vibrating air. Reality itself seemed to tease him, teasing limits that were never stable, never safe. A sudden metallic clang drew his gaze, a book falling, spinning mid-air, then landing with an almost deliberate thud. Shadows detached from walls and slithered across the floor with subtle intent. He stumbled forward, catching the edge of the warped desk, spinning slightly as the floor tilted beneath him. The whispering pressed in, threads of thought he believed private, teased and warped into half-formed visions. Awareness itself had become dangerous. He could not stop, he could not look away. The crescendo built, angles bent, surfaces shifted. The room seemed to inhale, stretching like soft metal, corners curling inward. Light fractured against reflective surfaces, shapes flitted at the edge of sight, servitors with too many limbs, spires bending against logic, faces of citizens bleeding into walls. Each micro-movement demanded calculation, reflex, attention. Every instinct was tested. Survival was no longer theoretical, it was immediate, visceral, and unforgiving. Breath ragged, sweat soaking his clothes, he sank to the floor, hands braced against the warped planks. The room pulsed around him, alive, responsive, aware. This was no longer observation, this was participation in a universe that judged thought itself. He understood. Knowledge drew attention, comprehension bore consequences, and yet he had survived this first confrontation with the warp's whispering hunger. But he knew the rules had changed, and nothing, not ink, not codices, could shield him from the next wave.
Morning brought no relief. The room had become alien, walls swaying like molten steel, corners collapsing inward then snapping back, ceiling trembling with a rhythm that made his teeth chatter. Floorboards warped beneath his boots, creaking with unnatural resonance. Each step demanded constant recalculation, as gravity itself seemed fickle, bending subtly against expectation. The air vibrated with sound, a low droning hum pressed against his chest, overlaid by dissonant murmurs curling around his ears. At times, the whispers grew coherent, teasing names, symbols, events once read and now distorted, spoken in voices both distant and intimately inside his mind. He recoiled, pressing his hands to his head, trying to separate hallucination from reality. His vision flickered, his body trembling in response. Books leapt from shelves, pages flaring open as if inhaling. Diagrams contorted into grotesque parodies, servitors sprouting extra limbs, cathedral spires bending into non-Euclidean angles, civilian faces bleeding into walls. He tried to look away, but his gaze betrayed him, compelled to follow every flicker of movement that suggested intent. The room was alive with subtle malice, each motion a test, a probe, a silent accusation. The mirror shattered without sound. Fragments hovered, rotating slowly, each shard reflecting a slightly different version of himself, eyes wider, skin paler, a shadow twitching at the corner of the mouth.
Stumbling backward, heart hammering, he grasped anything solid, desperate for reality's anchor. But stability was a memory. Nothing remained certain. Shadows pooled unnaturally along the floor, curling around corners as though conscious, tracking him. Outside, the city groaned. Footsteps, massive and unyielding, reverberated through walls. Not machines, not vehicles, but something vast, aware. It moved with knowledge of his presence, anticipation in its weight. Fear gripped him physically, wrapping limbs in ice, a visceral reminder that comprehension had consequences. He could sense the Imperium pressing in, a living, reactive dimension observing his thought. The whispering escalated, insistent. Threads of once private knowledge were plucked and reframed into hallucinations, merging with reflections, twisting diagrams and shifting floorboards. His pulse raced as shards of ceiling descended like frozen blades, walls bending to impossible angles, the room folding in on itself. Every lapse in focus could mean destruction. The fabric between the physical and the immaterial had thinned dangerously. A table spun slowly, dropped with metallic clang, shadows detaching from walls, crawling with predatory awareness. He pressed into a corner, body taut, gasping as the floor pitched beneath him. Light fractured, color bled into sound, and perception warped. The crescendo built relentlessly, a symphony of chaos. Shapes twisted, servitors with too many limbs, citizens' faces dissolved into walls, spires defying Euclidean logic. He felt raw warp energy brushing his mind, probing, testing, judging. Unable to stand, he sank to the ground, hands over ears, eyes wide, body trembling. The room rippled, bent and pulsed like liquid. He was enveloped by the totality of the Immaterium's presence. No longer whispers, no subtle distortions. This was unfiltered chaos, unmitigated, aware and reactive. Comprehension itself had become a liability. Every thought was observed, every theory weighed. Finally, the room stabilized slightly. Objects returned to approximate positions, shadows receded, whispers faded into tense silence. Yet he knew it was temporary. He had glimpsed the true nature of the galaxy, a living, reactive force, fully aware of those who sought understanding. Knowledge alone could not protect him. Observation attracted notice. Thought invited chaos. He had survived, but the rules had shifted irrevocably. This was no longer passive observation. This was immersion in a universe that judged, measured, and responded to comprehension itself. Survival required constant vigilance, and even then, it might not be enough. The rain-slicked streets hissed beneath his boots, reflecting fractured neon and the bruised sky above. Steam rose from vents and cooking pits, curling like restless tendrils, mingling with the metallic tang of machinery. Each inhalation brought a bite of ozone, acrid smoke, and the faint burn of wet stone. He moved cautiously, weaving between crates and crowded market stalls, alert to every sound, every shadow. One misstep could prove fatal. A servo skull drifted overhead, its lenses sweeping slowly and deliberately. The soft whir of pneumatic joints cut through the ambient hum of the city, startling vendors as wares rattled. He pressed against a tarpaulin, coiling his body, listening to the subtle clatter of boots on metal grates and the hiss of hydraulics. Breath came shallow, tasting rain and oil, muscles tensed for instinctive action. The narrow alley twisted unpredictably, walls slick with grime and scrawled with phosphorescent graffiti. Pipes hissed bursts of vapor in rhythmic cadence, forcing careful timing of each step. Patrols moved silently in efficient lines, scanning shadows, faces, and stray motion. He flattened himself against damp brick, eyes tracing bolters and armored boots, memorizing stance, reach, and intent. A stall erupted in sparks as a faulty conduit flared. He jumped back instinctively, landing on uneven cobbles, heart hammering. A child stumbled over a stone. A servitor's arm nudged him upright with precise, mechanical force. Smoke and steam mingled with the scent of wet metal and cooking grease, thickening the air. Stillness was vulnerability. Movement was survival. He ducked under dangling wires, brushing past a vendor displaying rusted cybernetic limbs. One limb clattered. He flinched at the sharp clang, scanning for enforcers. None appeared, yet danger hovered in every shadow. Conveyor belts carried scrap, hydraulic lifts hissed, and automated arms swung with rhythmic precision. Wet metal and puddles forced constant recalibration, each step deliberate, each pause measured. A narrow staircase spiraled upwards, slick and unstable. He climbed quickly, gripping splintered railings, listening to enforcers' footsteps echo above. Steam vents hissed sporadically, sending droplets across his back. Each motion demanded improvisation, agility, precision. The smallest error could expose him. Reaching a side gallery, he paused behind stacked crates. Steam curled around him, masking faint footsteps. Overhead, mechanical arms moved crates in measured arcs. A servo skull hovered, lens flicking in a scanning pattern, soft chirps marking its rhythm. He focused on tiny details, loose rivets, flickering lights, uneven pipes. Each could either conceal him or betray him. The corridor ahead narrowed. The hum of machinery and subtle vibrations underfoot reminded him that safety was an illusion. Rainwater dripped from broken skylights, mixing with soot and grime. He crossed puddles silently, ears straining for the slightest sound, approaching patrol, grinding gears, or metallic clatter. Survival required acute perception. Every step, glance, and breath was critical.
The corridor opened onto a maze of rooftops, slick with rain and littered with debris. Wind tore at his coat, whipping hair into his eyes, carrying the sharp tang of tar, smoke, and smoldering metal. Below, the city sprawled in endless tiers of steel and concrete, a labyrinth of industry and devotion. He sprinted along narrow ledges, leaping between tiles, careful to avoid fragile skylights. The streets beneath pulsed with life he could neither join nor control. A hunter-killer drone joined the wind, its searchlight sweeping methodically. Shadows darted under its gaze, forcing him to hug walls, muscles tense, breath quickened. He leapt across a gap, catching a drain pipe with one hand, feet scrabbling for grip on wet stone. The spotlight followed, slicing through fog and rain, heart hammering against ribs. Below, enforcer squads moved in calculated patterns, scanning streets and alleys with silent efficiency. One misstep could spell detection. He vaulted over a collapsed parapet, sliding to absorb impact, palms scraping jagged metal. Each heartbeat was a drum of survival. Hesitation could mean capture or worse. A narrow fire escape offered temporary refuge. He descended cautiously, hearing the hiss of joints and metallic clangs. Sparks erupted from exposed conduits. He twisted aside, coat singed at the hem. Lungs burned, legs ached, but the corridor led to an enormous industrial hall, where the ceiling loomed like a cavern. Conveyors clanged, pistons hissed, molten furnaces bathed the space in orange glow. Loose scrap and chemical puddles littered the floor. He darted across the conveyor belt, timing each step to avoid crushing presses and swinging hooks. Sparks flew, illuminating his path in brief flashes. Steam vents erupted nearby, forcing him to twist, scalding droplets splashing arms and face. Each movement required split-second precision. Survival demanded constant awareness.
Sliding down a refuse chute, he landed amid discarded machinery, metallic taste of fear lingering. Overhead, the drone swept past, narrowly missing him. Enforcer's footsteps echoed through the hall. He hugged shadows, scanning for concealment, pipes, scaffolds, gaps in the lighting. He pressed into a corner behind a massive furnace, steam coiled like living tendrils, heat radiating against soaked clothes. Each muscle screamed, nerves straining for the faintest cue. Sparks danced across the floor, reminding him that pursuit was constant, yet he remained still, letting the drone pass and enforcer sweep the hall. A narrow maintenance passage beckoned. Dim light flickered across grated floors. Pipes hissed above, wires sparked intermittently. He pressed against the wall, catching breath, listening to drone rotors fading, enforcer's steps receding. Relief was temporary, vigilance remained vital. Emerging onto a narrow rooftop, rain drummed his back, dripping down the nape of his neck. The city stretched endlessly, towers, factories, cathedrals, all etched with sigils and symbols demanding obedience. Each step measured, careful against wet tiles and loose rubble. The drone had retreated, but Enforcer's presence lingered, a shadow never fully escaped. A narrow catwalk offered relative safety. He crossed deliberately, surveying streets below, industrial complex behind, rooftops ahead. Lungs burned, body trembled. Immediate danger had passed, but the world remained indifferent, vast and merciless. One misstep could undo everything. Survival required constant adaptation. Knowledge alone was insufficient. Movement, awareness, and calculated risk determined life or death. He pressed onward, slipping into shadowed stairwells. The chaotic rooftop maze receded behind him, but the hunt persisted. Each careful step reminded him of the immutable truth. In this universe, knowing too much marked one as both predator and prey, and exposure could never be undone.
The chamber reeked of antiseptic, hot metal, and the faint lingering tang of wax. Every inhale brought a bitter, metallic taste that clung to the back of his throat. Cold steel pressed against his elbows and spine, reminding him that movement was limited. Pipes along the walls hissed, releasing bursts of steam that curled like restless serpents, while distant gears thrummed with a subtle vibration that resonated through the floor and into his bones. A servitor moved with deliberate mechanical grace, its joints clicking and lenses sweeping the room in patterns that seemed to anticipate his every twitch. From the shadows, the Inquisitor emerged, black robes absorbing the dim light, purity seals glinting faintly. Each step was deliberate, measured, and heavy with authority. Even silence felt like an accusation. He gestured toward the crystalline devices and stacked parchments on the table, tools of observation and control that radiated an unspoken dominance. The theorist felt his chest tighten. This was a battlefield of perception, and every detail mattered. Sit. The command was simple, yet absolute. Obedience was instinctive, but his mind raced. He lowered himself into the chair, noting every subtle tremor as the bolts in the floor transferred vibrations through the steel frame. The prism at the center of the table pulsed faintly, an irregular glow casting fractured light across his face. The servitor shifted slightly, aligning its lenses with the prism, amplifying whatever intent the device projected. Even the smallest detail seemed deliberate, designed to provoke unease. The first questions were mundane, almost innocuous, descriptions of the market, the streets, the enforcers, yet every word required precision. Misstep, hesitation, or excessive candor could betray understanding, or worse, reveal curiosity that was considered dangerous. His pulse quickened as the air seemed to thicken around him, carrying a low hum that pressed against his ears and chest. The room had become more than a physical space. It was a living instrument of scrutiny. A device on the table emitted a sharper glow, blue and quivering, its resonance intertwined with the faint thrum of the servitor and the distant, subtle vibration of the floor. The Inquisitor's voice cut through the tension. "You lingered too long near the child with the mechanical brace." The statement struck him.
A private hesitation, a fleeting moral impulse had been detected. His thoughts, normally his own, had been measured, recorded, reflected back in crystalline clarity. He swallowed hard, fingers tightening against the cold metal armrest. One misstep could be fatal, not in a physical sense, but in the total loss of autonomy the chamber could exact. The prism's glow intensified, light fracturing along the walls. Faint dark patterns writhed like crawling insects. Whispers threaded through the hum, fragments of prayers, cries, and faint echoes of the citizens he had seen suffer. Each whisper seemed to test his reaction, to measure subtle tension in his muscles, the twitch of an eyelid, the beat of his pulse. The air itself seemed to anticipate every decision. He tried to focus on tangible objects, the polished table edge, the servitor's moving limbs, the ridged floor beneath his boots. Yet the chamber expanded perception, bending reality into an active force. Shadows stretched along walls, corners shifted slightly, and every reflection on the crystalline surfaces revealed fragments of his own hesitation. Time became elastic. Moments were magnified, seconds dragged, carrying with them the weight of every choice he had ever made within the city. A sudden shift, the floor beneath him vibrated as though alive, humming in concert with the prism. Walls seemed to pulse subtly, ink creeping along seams in jagged, almost imperceptible patterns. His awareness sharpened to an edge. Every breath, blink, and thought carried significance. A faint flicker in the servitor's lenses reflected not light, but intent, as if it could read the gaps between his conscious calculations. The Inquisitor spoke again, calm yet authoritative. Observation alone is insufficient. Comprehension without obedience is heresy. Every hesitation, every impulse, every thought has weight. The words pressed down like solid iron on his chest. He felt exposed in a way that exceeded the physical. The chamber had become a mirror, a trap, and a lens focused on his mind. He could no longer distinguish between chamber and thought, between observation and action. Even the air seemed alive, dense and responsive. The prism pulsed once more, stronger, as if urging him to submit to the rhythm of the room. Survival required more than composure. It demanded awareness so acute that every movement became a negotiation with the environment, every blink a risk, every pulse measured. Sweat beaded his forehead, dampening his robes. Fingers trembled ever so slightly as he gripped the edges of the chair, trying to ground himself. The walls rippled faintly, shadows folding on themselves, corners bending to form angles that should not exist. Ink traced new paths on the parchments, diagrams mutating, lines twisting into shapes that suggested movement, awareness, and intent. The chamber was alive, and it was reading him. He forced a breath, willing his muscles to relax, while every nerve screamed vigilance. His eyes darted across the table. Prisms, coils, etched tablets, objects that had seemed inert, now thrummed with life. The hum of the chamber harmonized with his pulse, building a rhythm that pressed against sanity itself. One false gesture could unravel him completely, yet he remained upright, conscious, alert, ready to respond to subtle cues, masking every twitch, every thought, every micro-expression. The Inquisitor's final words echoed, soft yet resonant. "You have lingered, you have seen, you have understood, and yet you remain. Serve or be unmade." The threat was implicit, absolute. His body obeyed, but his mind recoiled. Submission was not a choice, it was the only path to survival. The chamber had tested him, consumed fragments of his autonomy, and marked him as present, observed, and recorded. Outside, the city awaited, indifferent, sprawling, and eternal. But within, the Ordo Malleus had claimed a part of him. Presence alone was no longer enough. Understanding now required acquiescence.
The prism's glow intensified further, fracturing the chamber with kaleidoscopic light. Each reflection seemed alive, twisting into impossible angles, as though reality itself had grown sensitive to his mind. The air vibrated with layered whispers,
prayers, screams, laughter, and murmurs from the city outside, woven together into a tapestry that pressed against his consciousness. His pulse matched the rhythm, each beat amplified by the chamber's unnatural resonance. Walls began to shift more noticeably, bending like molten stone. Parchments fluttered, diagrams rippling and elongating, twisting into grotesque parodies of servitors, cathedral spires, and civilian faces, all layered across the surfaces before fading back into static. The chamber had become both stage and predator, reflecting every micro-expression, every hesitation, every fleeting thought. "You lingered near the alleys," the Inquisitor's voice echoed, cutting through the sensory overload. "Your hesitation to intervene, your impulse to act, was observed, recorded, assessed." The statement pressed into him like cold iron. He could find no refuge. Every suppressed reaction, every thought he believed private, had been catalogued, refracted through the chamber, made visible. He focused on tangible objects, the cold steel chair, the polished table, the whirring servitor, yet each element now carried new significance, pulsing with the chamber's subtle anticipatory intent. Light fractured across walls, ceiling, and floor. Sounds overlapped, layering his memory with alien distortions. Even the vibration beneath his boots seemed alive, thrumming with the pulse of forces he could neither see nor name. Figures appeared at the edges of his vision, citizens he had glimpsed in the streets, frozen mid-step, faces wide with pleading, accusation, or silent judgment. They flickered, phasing in and out of the corner of his eyes, layered over the chamber itself. His brain struggled to separate memory, projection, and present reality. He blinked rapidly, trying to focus, yet they persisted, specters of observation, extensions of the Inquisitor's will. The servitor moved independently now, its mechanical arm extended, fingers brushing the edge of his sleeve. He flinched instinctively, chest tightening. The Inquisitor's voice remained calm, a scalpel against the chaos. "Every hesitation, every thought unspoken, is accessible. Obedience is no longer optional. It is the only path forward." He shivered, muscles coiling with tension. The chamber's architecture subtly shifted, ceiling arched impossibly, walls rippled with a dark liquid sheen, surfaces subtly breathing. Every micro-expression, every thought, every suppressed impulse was visible, detectable, measured. His breathing became shallow, each inhale deliberate, each exhale a struggle to maintain control. He understood now. The chamber itself was alive, aligned to his cognition, anticipating each reaction, each attempt at mental concealment. Then the Inquisitor's words arrived like a final judgment. "You may yet serve." The phrase was not relief, it was a binding. Survival was contingent on acquiescence, and freedom was no longer his own. The chamber began to settle. Ink retreated from the walls, the prism's light dimmed, the whispers faded into a tense, expectant silence. But the memory, the imprint of observation would persist. He was free in body only. His mind had been conscripted. The servitor moved beside him as he was escorted from the room, its lenses flicking back and forth, a silent sentinel recording every step. Beyond the chamber doors, the city sprawled, indifferent, unyielding. Rain slicked streets, and the distant hum of machinery greeted him. Yet within, he bore a new weight, awareness that comprehension could be weaponized, that thought itself was a commodity, a liability. The Ordo Malleus had claimed his mind, even as his body continued to obey. Every step outside the chamber reinforced the reality of his situation. Streets hummed with life, devotion, and industry, yet he moved through them with a new understanding. Observation alone was insufficient. Thought alone was dangerous. Survival required service, careful calculation, and the constant recognition that any action or inaction would be scrutinized, measured, and exploited. The city's machinery groaned in rhythm with his pulse. Steam hissed from vents, carrying with it the acrid tang of metal, oil, and damp stone. Every shadow became potential witness, every reflection a mirror of judgment. He pressed forward, each movement deliberate, controlled, rehearsed. Comprehension had drawn attention, and attention had a cost. He paused briefly at a market junction, glancing at the children and workers, the servitors and enforcers. Every face, every motion seemed imbued with purpose and observation. He realized that his previous freedom to think, to analyze, to interpret was now conditional. Every calculation, every moral hesitation, every question might be assessed and recorded. The Ordo Malleus had transformed understanding into chains, and he had stepped willingly or inevitably into them. With a final measured breath, he continued through the streets, acutely aware that each thought had weight, that comprehension was no longer abstract. It had become a vector for control, a measure of obedience. The city stretched endlessly before him, indifferent yet attentive, a vast network of observation and consequence. Survival demanded more than awareness. It demanded submission. And in that submission, he would navigate a universe where knowledge could both protect and condemn, and the price of thought was absolute.
The moment he stepped onto the uneven tiles of the hive rooftop, the air thickened, charged with an unseen tension that pressed against his lungs and made his teeth hum. The city stretched below, impossible in scale, every spire and bridge arranged at angles that seemed to bleed into one another, twisting perception. A static energy, almost electric, vibrated faintly along the metal beneath his boots. Something unseen was watching. Shadows moved at the edge of his vision, folding in on themselves before stretching upward, shifting with intent. He froze, heart hammering, toes gripping the slick tiles. Whispers threaded into his mind like steel threads, tugging at memories he had tried to suppress. The boy in the alley, the demonette glimpsed in the market plaza, the endless suffering of a city that had never slept. Each echo seemed to carry judgment, measuring his hesitation, weighing his fear. He moved cautiously, feet sliding over wet patches, glancing at the shifting presence that mirrored him in impossible ways. Every step was calculated, measured against some invisible clock that seemed to govern the movement of air and shadow alike. The figure ahead was barely perceptible, a prismatic demonette, half-formed, twisting with angles that should not exist. It mirrored his motion, always slightly ahead, forcing him to recalibrate his jumps, his landings, his balance. The rooftop itself seemed alive, subtly bending beneath each step. Pipes coiled into the air, railings twisted into impossible loops, and every motion demanded constant vigilance. A shiver ran through him as he noticed the warp bleeding into reality. A section of wall appeared to melt, black ink-like streaks crawling downward, while distant screams, orders, and dying prayers echoed faintly across the tiles. Each sound reverberated in his chest, pulling him forward with a mixture of dread and compulsion. He vaulted over a broken railing onto a lower platform, lungs burning, legs trembling, yet the figure flickered again, always observing, always pressing, always testing. The city beneath him warped subtly, streets looping into themselves, bridges bending backward, and towers leaning in ways that defied geometry. Shadows elongated unnaturally, curling like smoke, layering over the edges of the spires and rooftops. Even the wind seemed alive, whispering fragments of memories he had tried to lock away. He leapt across a gap, catching the support of a spire with hands slick from rain. Every breath seemed amplified, echoing unnaturally, as if the very air conspired to reveal him.
The demonet mirrored his movements, prismatic limbs slicing through space, creating impossible angles that forced him to twist, vault, and scramble. Sparks erupted from fractured panels and cables, momentarily illuminating the distorted cityscape like stuttering stars. Each flash revealed glimpses of shapes that should not exist, faces frozen in agony, citizens caught mid-step, impossible architecture bending like liquid steel. Racing along a narrow catwalk, he felt the pulsing presence of the warp pressing on his mind. Whispers sharpened, slicing into memory, dragging forth fragments of guilt, fear, and shame. The boy from the alley, the crushed citizens, fleeting visions of demon spawn, all seemed to converge in a chorus of accusation. Each movement, every leap, every breath demanded precision. Hesitation could spell obliteration, or worse, an imprint of him in this altered reality for eternity. He reached the edge of the catwalk, pausing just long enough to draw in a shuddering breath. The figure floated closer, now more solid, luminous, twisting angles into a shape that should not have been possible. Its eyes, or the sense of them, pierced him without sound. For a moment, he felt that comprehension itself was being measured. The world beneath and around him bent subtly in response, metal groaning, shadows folding, the air dense with the hum of unseen energies. He ran again, vaulting across fractured girders, scraping hands and knees on wet steel, every step a negotiation with gravity and the warp. The industrial rooftops below rippled, folding slightly with his passage. Steam hissed from vents, carrying an acrid scent that burned his throat and a metallic tang that made his teeth clench. The whispers had grown coherent enough to form half-phrases, threats and warnings, voices layering atop one another, echoing from corners that did not exist, from surfaces that should have been solid. Each leap carried the tension of potential collapse. Sparks erupted, sending shadows dancing across walls that should have remained straight. He felt himself being studied, judged, understood, and yet the entity did not attack. It observed, tested, noted every misstep and micro-adjustment. The rooftop itself flexed unpredictably, and he realized the environment itself was now part of the trial. Comprehension alone made him vulnerable. Understanding the warp's response meant risk. Finally, he reached a narrow spire connecting two towers. Each step resonated in rhythm with the whispers, the air charged, thrumming with unseen force. The demonet floated beside him, its form refracting light into impossible prisms, its gaze following his pulse and breath. He grasped the support beam, shivering, feeling the weight of being watched not by a creature, but by a mind vast, incomprehensible, indifferent, yet meticulous in its curiosity.
The figure shifted again, folding into impossible angles, alternately solid and translucent, and he felt the city itself pulse with its awareness. Each leap over fractured tiles, each scramble across girders was mirrored, measured, analyzed. The industrial spires groaned, bending subtly, and sparks leapt from ruptured conduits, illuminating fragments of a reality that had begun to obey rules of its own design. Whispers coalesced into words he recognized from memory, promises broken, screams unheard, lives extinguished in silence. Panic clawed at his chest, but he forced himself forward, vaulting over a conduit, gripping beams, sliding across slick metal. Every movement was an exercise in anticipation, every breath a calculation. He realized that survival depended not only on agility, but on comprehension of the warp's ever-shifting rules, on intuition tuned to the rhythms of this observing entity. The demonet solidified further, its limbs slicing through the air with prismatic clarity, yet never striking. It was a test, a presence that existed beyond opposition, measuring him for reasons he could not yet fathom. Below, the city writhed in subtle motion, streets twisting, bridges bending back upon themselves, shadows pooling and curling around structures, forming impossible geometries.
He lunged onto a narrow bridge connecting two towers, metal groaning beneath his feet. Sparks erupted from exposed conduits, momentarily illuminating the void below. Each landing threatened to shift the bridge's balance, each step a negotiation with the warp's influence, bleeding into matter. The whispers rose, overlapping layers of guilt, fear, and observation, a chorus of memory and menace. He felt the prismatic figure beside him, moving in perfect synchronization, always slightly ahead, always testing. Every decision, where to step, when to leap, how to balance, was evaluated in silence. The air itself seemed to thicken, vibrating faintly with the pulse of the warp. A low metallic hum threaded through the bridge, resonating with his heartbeat. He scrambled across the span, gripping twisted railings, sliding under pipes, lungs burning. The city beneath had become alien, streets looping impossibly, towers stretching into the clouds, the sky alive with arcs of green and violet lightning. Shapes flickered at the edges of perception, citizens frozen mid-step, distorted visions of demon spawn, reminders of the lives he had glimpsed and the consequences of comprehension. The prismatic figure paused at the far edge of the bridge, refracting light into impossible angles, prismatic and terrible. He felt the weight of observation, not malice but precise, clinical curiosity. It did not move to harm, only to measure, to record, to understand. He shivered, realizing that survival was now secondary to the fact of being seen. Comprehension itself had drawn his attention, and attention was non-negotiable. The air quivered, the whispers fading into a tense silence, but the residue of their presence lingered, pressing on his mind. He exhaled, trembling, aware of how the city, the warp, and this incomprehensible observer were intertwined. Reality had bent around him, tested his instincts, and acknowledged him as a conceptual anomaly. The world beneath, the sky above, the shadows and steel, they were no longer separate from the warp's scrutiny. Finally, the figure withdrew, folding into the shifting light, leaving him alone with the trembling metal beneath his hands and the charged, still thick air. Silence returned, hollow and resonant. The wind howled through the spires, carrying the faint hum of distant machinery, but now it was layered with the memory of observation, the sense of being measured by a god. He sank to his knees, gripping the beam beneath him, chest heaving, sweat mixing with rain. Each step, each leap, each breath had been noted, analyzed, integrated into a larger design he could not yet perceive. The warp's presence remained, a subtle vibration through the metal and air, a constant reminder that comprehension had consequences. As he rose, surveying the warped skyline, one unshakable truth settled deep in his mind. The gods were listening. Not out of anger, not purely out of curiosity, but because understanding itself had drawn him into their gaze. He had survived, yet nothing had been granted. He belonged now, in a sense, to forces vast, indifferent, and meticulous. Every thought carried weight, every memory was a thread under observation. The world continued, vast, alive, and unknowable, and he had been marked simply by noticing. The rooftop stretched before him, rain slick and gleaming, the city below humming with industrial life. He moved cautiously, aware that even the smallest action could ripple outward, captured in the infinite awareness of powers he could neither see nor challenge. Survival had become a question not only of agility, but of discretion, understanding, and acceptance, that being seen by a god was not an event, it was a state. He disappeared along a narrow catwalk, blending with shadows and mist, each step a negotiation with the watching presence. The prismatic figure lingered in memory, in perception, a constant reminder that comprehension had a price, and that the warp, in all its subtlety, had noticed him. The gods were listening, always, and he had no choice but to continue, measured at every moment.
The industrial square stretched outward like an exposed organ, a district built from necessity rather than design. Steel frameworks overlapped at erratic angles, girders layered atop older supports that had never been removed, only reinforced when they threatened to collapse. Chimneys vomited smoke into a low, permanent ceiling of haze, and conveyor systems screamed as they dragged ore, scrap, and unidentifiable cargo through the heart of the city. The ground beneath his boots was slick with runoff, blackened by oil and chemical residue, and each step carried the vibration of heavy machinery up through his legs and into his spine. This place was not hostile in the way battlefields were hostile. It did not rage or threaten. It simply functioned, indifferent to who was crushed beneath its rhythm. The theorist moved carefully, posture low, pace measured. He did not run. Running drew patterns. Patterns attracted attention. Survival here was an equation of timing, noise, and distance, one he had solved dozens of times before in calmer environments. The difference was scale. Everything here was louder, heavier, and less forgiving. Armored footsteps echoed across the square. He pressed himself against a load-bearing pillar as two enforcers passed through the fog, bolters cradled with professional ease. Their visors swept left and right, lenses reflecting the glow of furnace light and warning sigils. They were not hunting him specifically. They were enforcing a perimeter, responding to an alert whose source they did not understand. That made them more dangerous, not less. He waited until the sound of their boots blended back into the machinery, then moved again, slipping between stacked crates and broken transport rigs. A soft mechanical whine cut through the industrial din. He froze. Above the walkway, a Tau surveillance drone drifted into view, its spherical body rotating with precise, dispassionate grace. Optical sensors swept the area in overlapping arcs, painting the square in invisible grids of assessment. There would be no negotiation here, no warning. Identification would be followed by transmission, and transmission would end the margin he still possessed. He acted before thought could interfere. A discarded spanner lay half-submerged in a pool of runoff. He snatched it up and waited, muscles coiled, as the drone passed close to the catwalk's edge. The moment it crossed his position, he drove the tool into an exposed seam along its sensor housing. Sparks exploded outward in a violent flare of white-blue light. The drone shrieked, spiraling away, slamming into a gantry before collapsing in a cascade of burning fragments. The noise echoed far longer than he wanted. Machinery did not care. Something else did. From the shadowed mouth of a manufactorum archway, a tall metallic figure emerged, its limbs unfolding with mechanical precision, joints whispering as ancient mechanisms activated. Polished metal reflected the firelight without distortion, every angle exact, every surface pristine. Necron. Not advancing in rage, not charging in aggression, it moved like a curator approaching an unclassified relic. Its optics fixed on him with cold, predatory interest, not measuring threat, but value. He did not wait to see more. He ran. The industrial square fractured into a maze as he moved, catwalks branching into service corridors, ladders climbing toward higher platforms, maintenance routes never intended for unprotected use. He vaulted barriers, slid beneath pipes venting scalding vapor, and climbed a ladder 2 rungs at a time, lungs burning as the air thinned with height. The city seemed to cooperate with his pursuers. Paths narrowed, platforms ended abruptly, options collapsed inward, funneling him toward a single direction, upward. Pain flared along his forearm.
He glanced down to see a small, spider-like device clinging to his sleeve, metallic legs digging with surgical precision. A mind-shackle scarab. Its surface vibrated faintly as it probed, not for flesh, but for pattern, searching for thought, habit, reflex. With a sharp cry, he tore it free and hurled it into a turbine intake. The machine shrieked briefly before vanishing in a spray of sparks. The scar it left behind burned with a lingering hum, a reminder that something had already learned part of him. At the upper levels, motion became theater. A figure vaulted across the beams ahead, moving with impossible balance and deliberate flair. Colors shimmered across their armor, patterns shifting with every turn, every leap. A harlequin. They did not block his path. They did not attack. They danced just ahead of him, each motion guiding, narrowing, shaping his route with mocking elegance. He realized too late that he was being directed. The staircase spiraled upward, narrow and exposed, steam curling through the railings in thick, blinding coils. Below, the Necron advanced with relentless patience, metal limbs clattering against steel with measured inevitability. Above, the Harlequin spun and leapt, laughter cutting through the industrial roar like a blade. The city itself began to change. Angles stretched where they should not, railings bent subtly inward, shadows twisted on surfaces in ways that defied the light sources that cast them. The air grew heavy, pressing against his senses, threading old memories into the noise of machinery, half-remembered screams, fragments of testimony, the echo of lives catalogued and discarded. He burst from the stairwell onto the high-span bridge. The structure extended into the haze, a skeletal artery connecting manufacturing towers across a yawning industrial gulf. Wind tore across the span, carrying particulate ash and the distant roar of furnaces far below. The bridge swayed faintly under the weight of distant machinery, each vibration a reminder of how little separated him from the void beneath. Behind him, metal claws scraped against the stairwell's edge. Above, movement flashed, colorful and amused, and somewhere in the fog ahead, systems adjusted, calculations refined, and attention converged. There were no neutral observers here, no sanctuary, only factions, each with its own method of claiming what survived long enough to matter. He stepped onto the bridge and kept moving. The high-span bridge groaned beneath his weight as he moved forward, the sound carried away by the wind and swallowed by the industrial abyss below. Every step demanded balance. The bridge was old, reinforced repeatedly rather than replaced, its metal fatigued by centuries of constant vibration. Gusts tore at his clothing, dragging heat and ash up from the depths, stinging his eyes and burning his throat with the taste of oil and ozone. Behind him, the Necron emerged fully onto the span. It did not hurry. Its metal limbs articulated with deliberate precision, each step placed exactly where the bridge would hold. There was no urgency in its pursuit, only certainty. It was not chasing prey, it was securing property. Above, the Harlequin reappeared in a blur of motion, balancing effortlessly on a crossbeam that swayed violently beneath the wind. They bowed theatrically, mask reflecting furnace light and distant lightning alike. The gesture was not mockery, it was acknowledgement. The performance had reached a critical act. Ahead, a tower drone slid from the haze, its systems recalibrated, optics burning with steady focus. It did not fire. Instead, it tracked him, matching speed, measuring stride length, respiration, micro-hesitations. He understood then that it was no longer assessing threat. It was evaluating usefulness. The bridge became a corridor of converging intentions. He moved faster, boots slipping on frost-cold metal, fingers scraping against handrails worn smooth by generations of laborers who had never been meant to run across them. Pain flared through his ribs with every breath, a reminder of earlier impacts, earlier escapes. His body was nearing its limits. The city knew this. It always knew. A section of the bridge ahead buckled slightly as a cargo crane shifted its load somewhere far below. The vibration rippled through the span, loosening debris and sending fragments clattering into the void. He leapt without hesitation, landing hard, rolling to absorb the shock as sparks burst from stressed welds. The Necron adjusted instantly, claws extending to anchor itself against the sway. The drone drifted higher, maintaining line of sight. The Harlequin clapped once, a sharp sound swallowed by the wind. Then the warp pressed closer. The air thickened, not with heat, but with presence. Sound distorted. The roar of machinery stretched into low, overlapping harmonics, threaded with whispers that did not belong to the bridge or the city. Faces flickered in the corners of his vision. Workers, civilians, soldiers, none distinct, all familiar. The geometry of the span bent subtly, railings curving inward, distances elongating just enough to strain judgment. He staggered, catching himself against a support strut. This was not an attack, it was an invitation. The Necron paused, optics flaring as it recalculated around the distortion. The drone hesitated, algorithms struggling against variables that defied its models. Only the Harlequin seemed unaffected, moving freely through the warped space, tilting their head as if listening to a melody only they could hear. The message was clear without words. Escape existed, but never without cost. A hatch along the bridge's side burst open in a spray of steam. Inside, a maintenance tram sat idle, its systems partially active, emergency lights flickering. The drone shifted slightly, projecting a narrow corridor of light toward the opening. An offer, containment, extraction, survival under observation. Behind him, the Necron emerged fully onto the span. It did not hurry. Its metal limbs articulated with deliberate precision, each step placed exactly where the bridge would hold. There was no urgency in its pursuit, only certainty. It was not chasing prey, it was securing property. Above, the Harlequin gestured toward neither option. Instead, they stepped aside, revealing a third path, a fractured service walkway descending toward the manufactorum's interior. Unlit, unstable, vanishing into shadow and noise. No guidance, no guarantee, no witnesses. 3 exits, 3 prices. He understood them instantly. The Tau would let him live, but only as a controlled variable, studied, constrained, stripped of agency piece by piece. The Necron would preserve him perfectly, an artifact sealed outside time, alive yet irrelevant. The final path offered no protection at all, only uncertainty, erosion, and the slow loss of self beneath layers of compromise and survival. His hands trembled as he pushed himself upright. The bridge shuddered again as the warp receded slightly, pressure easing but not disappearing. The city exhaled as if impatient for his decision. He ran toward the fractured walkway. The Harlequin laughed softly, a sound of approval rather than surprise, and vanished in motion. The drone tracked him for a moment longer, then pulled back, interest replaced by recalculation. The Necron halted at the edge of the bridge, optics dimming as its target crossed into zones it did not deem efficient to pursue. The walkway collapsed partially under his weight, metal screaming as bolts tore free. He leapt, caught a railing, slid hard down a sloped maintenance chute, skin tearing, muscles screaming as gravity reclaimed him. He landed in darkness amid the roar of internal machinery, the sound deafening, absolute. For a long moment he did not move. When he finally rose, the bridge was gone from sight, swallowed by steam and steel. The city closed around him once more, indifferent, functional, alive. The warp lingered only as a pressure behind the eyes, a reminder rather than a threat. He had survived. Not because he was protected, not because he was chosen, because he had accepted that survival itself was the transaction. As he disappeared into the lower levels, one truth settled with quiet finality. There were no safe factions, no benevolent exits, only forces that demanded payment, and those willing to move long enough to decide which parts of themselves they could afford to lose.
The chamber was already finished with him before he understood where he stood. It was vast, but not grand. Scale here did not inspire awe, it erased reference. The walls rose beyond practical measurement, smooth plates of metal interrupted only by vertical conduits that carried power upward in steady, indifferent streams. There were no banners, no iconography, no attempt to intimidate. The architecture existed for throughput, not symbolism. He stopped walking because the floor markings ended. Yellow hazard lines terminated in clean administrative finality. Past them, the surface changed texture, denser alloy, faintly luminous, tuned for load-bearing rather than comfort. This was not a space meant for people to occupy for long. It was a space meant to receive. Servitors moved along fixed rails overhead and below, their paths intersecting with mathematical precision. None altered course for him, none reacted. Their presence was not surveillance, it was maintenance. He realized with a dull clarity that he was no longer being hunted, he was being processed. A voice spoke once, not amplified, not dramatic. Subject confirmed. No name, no rank, no inflection. He felt the words register in the chamber rather than his ears, as if the statement had been logged directly into the structure itself. The floor vibrated faintly, not a warning, not a threat, simply an acknowledgement that a state had changed. He had imagined this moment before, not heroically, not optimistically, but he had imagined resistance, interrogation, a final decision delivered by a figure with a face. Instead, there was a pause while systems aligned. He stood still because nothing in the room suggested that movement was relevant anymore. Light shifted, not dimming, not brightening, but resolving. Shadows snapped into consistent angles. Reflections in the metal walls ceased their earlier distortions and became accurate, unforgiving mirrors. For the first time since entering the complex, the environment stopped responding to his presence. That, more than anything else, frightened him. A panel opened along the far wall with a sound like a ledger being closed. From it emerged a thin mechanical arm terminating in a cluster of lenses and auspex nodes. It did not approach him. It rotated once slowly and then retracted. Data had been acquired. Proximity was not necessary. He waited for a sensation, pain, pressure, intrusion, but none came. Instead, a second voice spoke, this one layered, clearly the output of multiple authorities filtered into a single procedural channel. Assessment complete. Threat classification, non-hostile. Risk classification, persistent. Value classification, conditional. Conditional. The word echoed longer than the others. He thought briefly of arguing, of explaining. The reflex rose automatically, the same reflex that had carried him through archives, debates, forbidden annotations. But there was no interface here for persuasion, no listener. The system was not wrong, and therefore could not be convinced. A narrow platform extended from the wall in front of him, stopping precisely at the boundary where the floor texture changed. Its surface was bare, no restraints, no rails. An instruction appeared as text along the platform's edge, projected in low Gothic script so clean it felt impersonal to the point of cruelty. Step forward. He did not move immediately, not out of defiance, out of uncertainty. For the first time, the absence of threat left him without a role. There was nothing to evade, nothing to analyze, no behavior that altered outcome. The platform did not hurry him. The chamber did not react. Eventually, his body complied because standing still served no purpose. The moment his foot crossed onto the platform, the chamber updated. Walls that had seemed distant resolved inward, not physically moving, but conceptually narrowing. His position was no longer relative, it was indexed. The platform descended smoothly, soundlessly, carrying him into a vertical shaft lined with inactive alcoves. Some were empty, some were not. He did not look long enough to inventory them. That too felt unnecessary. The system already knew what was stored here. Observation would not add value. The descent ended without warning. The platform aligned with a smaller chamber, modular, enclosed, defined by its function rather than its dimensions. This space felt final not because it was restrictive, but because it was complete. Everything required to conclude his trajectory was already present. At the center stood a containment frame, not a cage, not a field, a scaffold of layered protocols, each invisible until needed. He understood its purpose intuitively, not to restrain the body, but to fix context. Another voice spoke, quieter time. Containment option pending authorization. Options. Execution was one. He knew that without being told. It was the simplest path, administratively elegant. Servitorization was another, conversion of complexity into utility. Stasis, indefinite, resource efficient. Eternal interrogation, wasteful but thorough. Each preserved matter, none preserved identity. He was not asked to choose. He stepped into the frame because the frame existed, and existence here implied use. The structure activated without ceremony. No pain followed, no force. The sensation was closer to alignment, like being slotted into a definition that had been waiting. He felt something loosen inside him then, not fear, not relief, expectation. For the first time since this had begun, the universe stopped asking anything of him. And that, he realized, as the chamber sealed and the system finalized its records, was the true function of containment. Not punishment, not protection. Closure. Time lost its shape first. There was no darkness, no sleep, no sudden rupture. Instead, duration thinned. Moments became entries. Sensation resolved into categories. Vital signs stable. Cognitive function intact. Resistance absent. He could feel these determinations occur without experiencing them directly, as though his existence had been translated into a language that no longer required his participation. The containment frame adjusted once, imperceptibly, a calibration rather than a correction. Above him, though above no longer held spatial meaning, systems conferred. Not voices in debate, but data streams intersecting, resolving contradictions, eliminating redundancies. Somewhere in the lattice of authority, a decision matured, not hurried, not hesitant, simply complete. Execution denied. The words arrived without emphasis. No relief followed,
Execution had never been frightening here. It was clean, final, efficient. What replaced it was worse precisely because it was practical. Servitorization deferred. A pause, longer this time, not for his sake, but because additional conditions were being evaluated. Neural integrity, conceptual resilience, the risk of informational contamination. Stasis rejected. Resource inefficiency exceeds threshold. Each option fell away, not as mercy, but as optimization. He became aware, dimly, that his thoughts were still occurring, but no longer leading anywhere. They rose, formed, and dissolved without consequence. The containment field was not suppressing cognition, it was decoupling it from relevance. Finally, the conclusion rendered itself. Assignment confirmed. The frame released him, not physically, but categorically. The sensation was subtle, a pressure lifting that he had not known was present. The chamber reconfigured, panels sliding aside to reveal a passage that had not existed moments before. A corridor, not an exit, a continuation. He walked because walking remained the correct response to corridors. Habit persisted longer than identity. As he moved, he noticed that the environment no longer reacted to him at all. No distortions, no whispers, no psychic pressure. The warp's attention, so oppressive before, was absent here. This place was beneath its notice, shielded not by wards, but by irrelevance. That realization hurt more than fear ever had. Along the corridor, alcoves displayed inactive terminals, each one marked with sigils of the Ordo Malleus. He recognized the pattern now. These were not cells, they were stations, contextual nodes within a system too large to be observed from inside. He stopped at one because the corridor ended there. A final interface activated, projecting text rather than sound. You will no longer observe. You will contextualize. The words settled into him with the weight of doctrine. Understanding bloomed, not revelation, but classification. His role was not to question, analyze, or interpret freely. It was to provide framing, to exist as a reference point within controlled parameters. His experiences, his insights, his very anomalies would be extracted, filtered, and redeployed without attribution. He would not speak, he would not warn, he would not decide. He would be cited. The interface continued. Autonomy, non-essential. Memory integrity, partial. Identity designation, redundant. He felt something slip then, not violently, not painfully, like a name forgotten that no one else remembered either. The edges of self softened, details losing priority. Personal meaning drained away, leaving only functionally relevant impressions. The boy in the alley became a data point. The whispers became background noise. Fear became a variable already accounted for. A servitor approached, not menacing, not attentive. It adjusted a node at the base of the terminal, and the world clarified one last time. Not sharpened, simplified. He understood then that he had not been spared. He had been preserved in the way ink preserves a margin note, useful only in relation to a text written by others. There was no final statement, no judgment, no closing threat. The system simply moved on. Somewhere, a record updated to reflect that containment had been achieved. Somewhere else, a workflow advanced to the next task. And within the vast, uncaring machinery of the Imperium, one anomaly ceased to be a person and became a reference. He remained alive, but nothing remained that could call itself him.
He stepped into the archive, the reality of the chamber hitting him first: gray walls, compact shelves, and the faint hum of machinery. The manifests sprawled before him, numbers aligned perfectly, every calculation precise. His mind approached them with confidence. Logic and patience, he believed, could master this bureaucracy. The room smelled faintly of metallic oil, a sterile reminder that the world was real, and yet, somehow, indifferent. He traced the edge of a document with a finger, noting the texture of ink and paper, but the atmosphere remained dull, almost apathetic, as though the universe itself barely acknowledged his presence. Light flickered overhead, a subtle metronome marking the seconds of his pride. He moved along the aisles, scanning the data, each step sharpening the sense that nothing here could be tamed by intellect alone. A picked capture terminal caught his attention, tucked in a corner. He approached, expecting only a reflection, but the surface shimmered unnaturally, an eldritch distortion of motion that did not align with his steps. Numbers dissolved into grids, flowing and reorganizing themselves as he moved. The archive observed him, not as a scholar, but as a participant, already folded into its system. The floor vibrated faintly beneath his boots, resonating with a hum from a central lattice. He adjusted his pace, timing his movements carefully with the rhythm of machinery and power surges. A servitor passed, its massive steel frame moving with silent precision. Its lens swept the floor just inches from his boots. He froze, then exhaled as the moment passed. Even fatigue could not dull the awareness. Every misstep might trigger containment or observation. Ahead, containment fields shimmered in layered grids, light fracturing into impossible angles. He approached cautiously, noting how the energy reacted to proximity, almost as if the room itself measured intent. Sparks jumped from conduits unpredictably, illuminating twisted reflections in the polished steel, partial faces, limbs where none should exist, figures of laborers and citizens reduced to impersonal forms. Every observation felt like calibration, indexing, absorption. A mechanical voice, monotone, echoed across the chamber. Subject located. Processing parameters active. It was not addressed to him, yet it filled the space completely. Motion was compulsory. Observation alone carried consequence. He pressed forward, slipping along narrow catwalks, ducking under conduits, boots slick with oil, aware that the lattice pulsed with attention, registering hesitation, fear, even calculation. Shadows shifted unnaturally along the walls, corners elongated, panels stretched at angles that defied instinct. He adjusted each step, timing every leap and grasp with care. Sparks from exposed wiring painted the chamber in brief, jagged light, revealing geometry that refused consistency, spirals and arcs where right angles should exist. His hands clutched railings that vibrated in rhythm with his pulse. A prism-like device descended from above, refracting light into intersecting grids that dissolved before they could be memorized. Shapes within the lattice twisted subtly, reflecting fragments of motion but never meaning. He stumbled once, caught himself, and continued. The structure stretched endlessly, yet a path remained, defined not by walls, but by procedural logic. With each step, understanding became irrelevant. The archive did not care for insight or interpretation. It recorded, indexed, processed. He was no longer an agent of inquiry, but a conduit of movement. He adjusted instinctively, following a choreography imposed by the archive itself. Every inhale, every hand placement, every footfall was registered. At a junction of converging catwalks above an empty shaft, he paused only long enough to register the absence of instruction.
No warning, no choice. Motion resumed. He understood then that this was not a test or puzzle. It was assimilation, quiet and methodical. Forward motion narrowed to function alone. The grids expanded to accommodate his trajectory. He did not resist because resistance had no value. Sparks leapt across the metal as he reached the far edge of the platform, fractured reflections of machinery and catalogued lives flashing briefly in the steel. A narrow corridor opened ahead, unlit, soundless except for the machinery's hum. No directive followed. Movement remained the only requirement. He stepped forward, aware that every breath and stride was logged, and that pausing itself would become data. The archive did not judge, it processed. And with that, the first phase ended. He was no longer merely observing. He had been aligned, indexed, and prepared for what followed. An existence no longer defined by understanding, but by placement within a system that did not need him to know it at all.
The corridor continued, unmeasured, as if length itself had been rewritten. Each step produced no echo. Sound was optional, a courtesy the structure chose not to extend. Walls carried no seams, no identifiers, only uniform surfaces that reflected nothing back. Even his outline failed to register. Motion itself had become function, and he walked because that was his role. Manifests reappeared, but not as text. Numbers flowed like living currents, adjusting around his passage. The arithmetic had never been a challenge, it had been a sieve. The archive had permitted him through because he resisted nothing, offered nothing that could not be catalogued. Observation was irrelevant, only movement mattered. A panel opened along the right wall, revealing a vertical space that extended beyond perception. Bridges crossed it at irregular intervals, carrying figures moving with identical cadence, stripped of identity. They wore differing uniforms, bore differing insignia, but their motion was uniform. Task followed task, order followed order. None looked up, none acknowledged existence. He tried to stop, and his legs continued, obedient to a system that no longer required consent. A doctrine impressed itself upon his cognition. Participation voids interpretation. Not a warning, not advice, but a processing rule. Observers existed only outside. Participants were variables, inputs for the machinery. Each movement of the figures below adjusted seamlessly to maintain flow. One stumbled, another replaced them. No acknowledgement, no pause. The system functioned regardless of consequence or loss. He felt his hands change, subtly, joints smoothing, skin dulling. Function replaced sensation. Feedback was optional. Input persisted, output merely processed. His body was being normalized, assimilated into procedural rhythm. Conscious thought remained, but autonomy diminished with each step. A horizontal opening appeared, revealing a chamber layered with structured grids of light. Symbols moved, intersected, dissolved, and recombined faster than observation could follow. The sky beyond was not sky. It was a reference space, a constantly updating index that allowed no prolonged gaze. Crossing the threshold, he felt immediate recognition, not as anomaly, but as entry. His presence completed a system. Data streamed into him, not knowledge, not insight, but context. Billions of lives passed through, cataloged and reduced to throughput. Past events, witnesses, consequences, all were assimilated into his perception without retention. The boy from the alley appeared once, not as ghost, accusation, or warning, but as a timestamp, an indexed line item. Emotional weight dissolved. Resistance was irrelevant. Breath slowed involuntarily. Respiration became procedural, a subordinate function. The corridor had never led anywhere. It had been converting him with every step.
Each movement, each inhale had aligned him with the architecture's function. He was no longer apart. He was part, integrated, a reference point within the archive. At the end of the chamber, a final partition dissolved. Beyond it, a workstation awaited. No restraints, no instruments. A designation appeared, not a name, not a title, but a role, contextual asset. The term conveyed neither threat nor comfort. It was definition, assignment, and completion. His life, his mind, his perception, all had been subsumed into operational order. The workstation activated, streams of data aligned around him, the archive expanding to include its newest reference. Operations continued above, below, everywhere, uninterrupted and indifferent. He stood, no longer observer, no longer participant in understanding. He had become function, recorded, indexed, and aligned. And in that final moment, comprehension failed entirely. He could not frame, could not analyze, could not hold the setting at arm's length. The system had consumed the margin that allowed separation. There was only the role, only the archive, only the unbroken, relentless structure of the universe, indifferent, procedural, absolute. He remained standing, not as a person, as a footnote that breathes.
In the end, the theorist became part of a system he could never hope to understand. The galaxy continued, indifferent, vast, and unknowable. What is observed cannot always comprehend, and what participates is never granted perspective. Warhammer 40,000 goes on, unbending, unstoppable, eternal.